Let's begin this commentary to the fifth conference. To understand initiation in ancient Egypt, we need to go back to the moment when the moon separated from the earth's mass, thus in the middle of the Lemurian era, with the trinity of sun, moon, and earth. In this lecture, Rudolf Steiner takes us even further back to the middle of the Hyperborean era, when the duality of sun and earth-moon was still in place. In those primordial times, in spiritual terms, there was nothing but man. However, the germs of animal and plant life had already been brought into being, and when the sun began to separate, the animal germs started to come to life. As the sun completely detached itself from the earth-moon mass, the plant germ were brought to life. Then, with the separation of the moon, that is, halfway through the Lemurian era, the mineral germs were formed. Therefore, it is there that we must then search for the origin of the earth and consequently of the cosmos in a physical sense. Up to that moment, everything was in a supersensible state. And so it was that on Earth, in physical terms, those same waves of life began to appear in their physical form in reverse order, crystallized in physical forms as we described in the previous meetings: minerals, plants, and animals. So, in a supersensible sense, animals and plants are generated first, and then minerals. In a physical sense, the opposite sequence occurs: minerals, plants, and animals. In the beginning, man was at the origin of all the kingdoms of nature in a spiritual sense. He would only appear at the end in a physical sense, after all minerals, plants, and animals had appeared in a physical sense. So, there is a real exchange. Spiritual man in the beginning differentiates into supersensible animal, plant, and mineral. Then, when the physical substance begins to emerge on Earth and in the physical cosmos, minerals, plants, and animals appear, and finally the human being in a physical sense. Really a reversal. When the Earth contained the two luminaries, the sun and the moon, everything was immersed in an etheric nebula that expanded to the current orbit of Jupiter, in which, in a diffused form, the supersensible germs of the human being and of the natural kingdoms were infused. This supersensible etheric nebula was permeated by heat until a luminous sphere of vapor formed. So, at that point, there were both heat and light, and they could have been felt to the touch and seen with eyes capable of perceiving light and shadow, if there had been organs to sense it. What Rudolf Steiner tells us here clearly comes from his clairvoyance. So it's a supersensible eye observing the evolutionary stages that gradually change from supersensible to sensorial. This light expanded into the etheric nebula so that all the germs were finally permeated by light. All the minerals, metals, solid and liquid substances that were contained in there in a potential form. The nebula was illuminated from within and became brighter and brighter as the substance that today we would call air was formed. And so, in the Hyperborean era, an enormous sun appears, shining in the cosmic space. The earth at this point is one with the sun, and consequently, the earth together with the moon is one with the sun. Everything then was sun, and it was a recapitulation of the metamorphosis of ancient sun. So everything that happened, in a certain sense, during the ancient sun metamorphosis of earth and the cosmos, what everything was embedded in light air, is recapitulated in a denser form, we can say relatively denser, in the Hyperborean era on Earth, just as ancient Saturn had been recapitulated in the Polarian era and ancient Moon in the Lemurian era. So, there is a parallelism between these four metamorphoses that you see summarized here. Ancient Saturn, Sun, Moon, and Earth going from left to right, and then the eras of Earth from the Polarian to the Hyperborean to the Lemurian on to the Atlantean that we have already mentioned. The Polarian is a recapitulation on Earth of ancient Saturn, the Hyperborean a recapitulation on Earth of ancient Sun, and the Lemurian era a recapitulation on Earth of ancient Moon. In the primordial light there lived both man and the kingdoms of nature, which were in a supersensible state of becoming, and also the higher spiritual hierarchies, which had not taken on a physical body, but passed through this substance that was still largely supersensible and that was only beginning to give as a potential what would later become the sense world. So there were angels, archangels, and archai, the members of the third hierarchy, as well as Elohim, virtues, and dominations, which are the members of the second hierarchy, and even thrones, cherubim, and seraphim, which are the members of the first hierarchy. The earth was then a luminous sun inhabited by all beings, from the most humble to the most sublime, in what is called the golden chain, catena aurea, or great chain of being. This great chain of being, that we could also call great golden chain of being, if we want to give it a full name, was an unbroken chain that went from the realms of nature, still potential, to all the hierarchies, even the most sublime ones, cherubims and seraphim of the first hierarchy. At the center of this chain stood man and the third hierarchy. So all beings, from the most sublime to the most, shall we say, humble, were interwoven in this earth that was completely permeated by solar forces. This light that radiated in the cosmos was the force of love that was given to everyone, to this great golden chain of being, to these beings that made up the cosmos. The light was love, and it was given to the cosmos and to all beings, from the most sublime to the most humble. It was the divine love that will later become man's mission to develop in freedom on earth. So, what's the difference? The difference is that the hierarchy of the seraphim, the spirits of love, can do nothing but give themselves as love. So, in a sense, they are not free in this. That is, they are love. The moment they cease to be love, they become the opposite of love. Their very being would be completely changed into a different being, that is, into a hierarchy of the obstacle. This is very different than a human being choosing love in freedom, because in the course of evolution, man has profoundly united with the element of freedom, that is, of knowledge. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. On the basis of this, love in humans takes on a new, we could say, substance of freedom. Thus, what we call morality is born. If a seraphim were to stop donating love, it would become an anti-seraphim, and a different spirit would take the place of the one that has become an anti-seraphim. It would take the regular place of the one that has become an anti-seraphim. This applies to all hierarchies, and therefore you understand that man, by virtue of what we can call its evolution, in which anomalies, so to speak, have been inserted, that we call evil, has acquired unique characteristics that can eventually be given to other hierarchies who, however sublime, do not possess the element of freedom as experienced or experienceable and gradually conquerable by man. And of course, you also understand that this means that Christ, who united so deeply solar evolution with earthly evolution, is the one who adds the other ingredient to human earthly evolution, which is love combined with freedom. The Christ brings to maturity the free will of Lucifer, which is immature, and unites it with his love, which is life. So knowledge becomes freedom, life becomes love. If we go out into nature, we find wisdom, which is knowledge combined with life. But only man can bring freedom combined with love. This is because this divine love that is fused, given out in the cosmos by the seraphim, and then poured into all the hierarchies, cherubim, thrones, dominations, virtues, Elohim, archangels, angels, man, does enter nature, animals, plants, and minerals. But what happens? It becomes an exteriorized form. Where do we find the love of the seraphim if we go into nature? We find that it has been transformed, rendered into form, in particular through the action of the Elohim, who are the hierarchy of the sun. Just imagine, they take this force of love of the seraphim, and through their being they make it into the forms of creation. In this sense, theirs is a force that crystallizes and externalizes. But if we want to find it active in the interiority of living beings, we must look at the human being, at what man touches in a moral sense. If you recall, we said that man donates moral forces to nature. It is because he awakens them within himself through his own forces. So even today, from the present sun, these forces radiate from the solar hierarchies. The present sun is the body that detached from the mass of the Earth-Moon halfway through the Hyperborean era. With every ray of light coming from the sun, a force is brought to Earth, the force of the entities that united with the sun in their evolution after the sun separated from the Earth-Moon. Love is infused in every ray of sunlight. That love which is poured out by the seraphim and taken in by the spirits of the sun, the Elohim, then given out as form-giving forces. That same love which can be radiated here on earth from that which is the sphere of the sun dwelling in every human being, namely the heart. The love radiating from the human heart also gives form to what? To relationships, just like the love that is transformed into a form-giving force by the Elohim generates relationships in nature throughout all of creation. Animals, plants, minerals, the whole ecology is relationship. It is a relationship of cosmic love that was brought, to use a simplified but clear image, by the seraphim through the hierarchies to the Elohim, and that the Elohim in the Genesis, in creation, put into action in the form of the relationships that exist in nature among beings. The love that radiates from the heart and weaves in human hearts is therefore of the same substance as the divine love that emanates from the sun. In particular, the warmth that we perceive in sunlight is cosmic love that was originally given in ancient Saturn by the seraphim as the mantle of love that envelops all of ancient Saturn, and that was thus received as a gift by all spiritual hierarchies inferior to the seraphim. So we must imagine that in this creation the first hierarchy gives of itself. Love is given by the seraphim, harmony by the cherubim, will or courage by the thrones. Together with this, the second hierarchy gives its gifts. Wisdom is given by the dominations, movement by the virtues, and form by the Elohim. This is how all these sublime spiritual impulses of the hierarchies come together here on earth. And I want to remind you that the entities of the third hierarchy, that is, archai, archangels, and angels, remained united to the earth, while the second hierarchy elevated with the sun and the first hierarchy maintains a more cosmic role, so to speak, going beyond the sphere of Jupiter, therefore including Saturn, the zodiac, and the primum mobile, first movable. Each single hierarchy can also be seen as the divine intelligence that moves the heavenly spheres, and it is in this motion of the heavenly spheres that we find the very being of such entities. So, even though the detached from the earth with the mass of the sun, these higher hierarchies that we can also call gods because they're able to create, continue to emanate these forces in the cosmos, pouring them onto our planet. Where can we start talking about gods in the hierarchies? From the Elohim upwards, as creator gods. We have to imagine that man was in fact the lowest, the most inferior, shall we say, of all these superior beings. Below man were the kingdoms of nature, whose germs had already differentiated from man in the previous metamorphosis of the earth, namely moon, sun, and Saturn. Man, therefore, is the new child of the earth in such a way that the superior entities of the hierarchies took care of him, keeping him in their womb. Man, therefore, was an organism developing within the being of the hierarchies, as if he were, in fact, the prolongation of the hierarchies, an organ of the hierarchies. Man possessed a body woven out of the most subtle elements. These most subtle elements had gradually differentiated, and you can see them in this diagram, which at first may seem complex, but you will be able to understand it quickly. I'll give you an example. Let's focus on the bottom part, where you can see how the life ether is divided into etheric air, life ether, chemical ether, and then in turn into liquid air, life ether, chemical ether, and etheric light. In this lecture, Steiner describes the passage from the Polarian era, which you can see in the mid-band, to the Hyperborean era. From this original nebulous, an etheric sphere of heat is formed, as well as a luminous sphere of etheric mist, which also has a liquid element. So in the diagram, aside from the first column that simply indicates period, phase of development of the Earth, and type of ether, we look at first, second, and third columns, beginning of the so-called 172nd form condition, which is in fact the present Earth, then Polarian era and Hyperborean era. So the human body was interwoven with the most subtle elements, that is to say, with etheric liquid in the form of vapor, with etheric air, with the ether of life, or we could say more simply with life, with the chemical or sound ether, and here Steiner will speak mostly about sound, and finally with etheric light. At a later stage, etheric heat will also appear. So, the human being is interwoven within a series of substances that gradually differentiate into more subtle and more dense. The form of this human being of the Hyperborean era is that of a chalice open upwards, with the light shining within it, and whose consciousness is immersed in dreamless sleep. These chalices interpenetrated each other, not having fixed boundaries. That is, they could be distinguished, but they could also interpenetrate. Neither were they limited by the earth's mass, so that, in their rising like flowers, they expose themselves to the light of the spiritual hierarchies that radiated to them from the sun towards the earth-moon. This was the man-plant of the recapitulation of ancient sun in the Hyperborean era of the earth. Just as there was a totally spiritual man-plant, we could say, on ancient sun. On earth, this stage was recapitulated in the Hyperborean era, and a similar form appeared. Not the same, though, a denser one, interwoven in the etheric and gradually in the elements that become denser as the ether differentiates. In such a body, interwoven in the subtlest elements, the forces of spiritual entities could infuse themselves, entities that were, let us say, helping the evolution of the earth, that were united with the evolution of the earth. Therefore, the sun gave its forces from above for the evolution of the earth. The tenuous light of the man-plant radiated towards the hierarchies, while the powerful spiritual light of the hierarchies radiated within the chalice of the human flower. When the light was woven into these extremely subtle elements, movements of color were produced that pervaded this whole etheric nebula of the earth. Though we are still talking about the stage where everything is united, clearly there were radiating entities, the higher hierarchies, and receiving entities, the lower hierarchies, and in particular man with the kingdoms of nature. So everything is still immersed in light, but there are those who give light, who are the higher spiritual hierarchies that will then move away with the sun, and the lower hierarchies and man who receive that light from the higher solar hierarchies. Or rather, if you like, the future higher hierarchies that will leave Earth with the sun. In this luminous primordial unity, in this luminous sphere of liquid etheric fog, before the parting of the sun, the hierarchies cradled and nurtured the man plants in a garden of lights and colors. These human beings, man plants or man flowers, were connected to the densest part of the earth by an umbilical cord, while outside the terrestrial cosmos was gradually forming. When the sun began to separate and a duality began to form, it took with it the finest ethers, the finest substances, in particular heat and light. Together with these, the entities of the solar hierarchies also left the earth, because heat and light constituted their evolutionary environment. They could no longer remain united to the earth. These fine ethers and the entities that managed to inhabit them went on to form the present sun. So you have to imagine that the present sun is made up of the finest ether that continuously radiates light and heat. The entities that join the sun are the solar hierarchies, and they gradually differentiated, as we said last time, into the hierarchies that instead stayed on Venus and Mercury. So originally we had Sun, Venus and Mercury detaching from Earth. Then what would become the Sun detached Venus and Mercury from itself, and Venus detached Mercury from itself. These fine ethers, or the radiating light and heat, were now found in the cosmos. On Earth instead, the vapor cooled down, condensing into water. We are moving from the Hyperborean era to the first half of the Lemurian era, because the denser elements are also beginning to form. The Earth, therefore, went from being a gaseous globe to becoming an aqueous globe. Everything was water, though of various densities, so much so that denser waters gradually differentiated from a less dense mist. So, water in the center, mist all around. Gradually, denser and heavier waters differentiated from waters that became thinner and more volatile. The germs of the man plants, which before were immersed in light, now needed to descend into the waters. Beforehand, they were chalices of light. Now they took on aquatic forms, half emerging from the waters and half immersed in the waters. So one half of them was in the denser water, and the other half in the less dense mist. As Earth was completely liquid in the center and enveloped by mists on the outside, man too was half water and half vapor. so that the light of the sun, now radiated from the outside, reached man only the upper part composed of vapor, that is, in the part that emerged from the waters. In fact, the waters were still penetrated by the mass of the moon, thus too dense and dark for sunlight to reach them. The light of the sun could therefore only illuminate the surface of this immense ocean that was the terrestrial globe, and in whose depths darkness held sway, harboring the moon with its hardening forces. It was still a moon Earth. Since the sun had taken away its heat and light, the Earth had become relatively dark and cold, relatively with respect to the sun, of course, and it received light and heat from the outside. In the Earth, sound had remained interwoven, particularly in the waters. Sound shaped the water, giving it the ability to take on forms that could also change. They were wave forms. They changed according to a rhythm that is at the same time, we could say, musical and chemical. All chemistry is music that we cannot hear, just like all music is chemistry that we can hear. So sound, as a formative force, divided and organized the masses of water in a continuous process of becoming. The human body was formed by this sound that had remained interwoven in the waters of planet Earth. Keep in mind that we are still talking about supersensible conditions, so this would not yet be a globe of water that could be perceived as we understand it. It is something that is becoming denser, so nothing that is scientifically investigable from an external materialistic point of view has begun yet. All that will begin as a precipitation, so to speak, of cosmic evolution when the elements that science calls atoms are actually formed. Before then, everything is still completely interwoven in an ether, therefore informative forces. In these conditions, the supersensible human being was dual. The upper part was a body of vapor that was pervaded by light, by the heat radiating from the sun, and the bottom part was a body of water that was pervaded by the sound of the water in the earth still united with the moon. This caused the human being to feel that the solar hierarchy is no longer shown within it, but above it. These forces gradually infused the upper half of its body, while the lower half was formed by sound. So, the human being felt divided into two halves. The upper half, still permeated by the light of the sun, was thinner, and the lower half, denser, took on a form suitable for water. This is how a form took shape in the external physical evolution, that, when appearing in the evolution of the earth, will be the fish. This supersensible, spiritual human being in this form gradually expelled from itself the fish archetype, which we ultimately find in the fish that gradually evolved on earth in a physical sense. Where can we find the spiritual archetype of the fish? In the human being that, once the sun had separated from the earth, lived half facing the sun and half immersed in water. The part that was in the water will then detach and become the archetype that will operate in a formative way on what we call fish. These fish were no longer men flower. We can call them men fish, so to speak, and they felt nostalgic for the sunlight that no longer shone from within them as when they were men flower, but from outside, from above. These men-fish stretched towards the light, and this reaching upwards to connect as much as possible with the light of the sun became the nostalgia for the condition of union with the sun, for what was gradually being lost, the solar paradisiacal condition, which in itself will go through a crisis when the luciferic spirits enter it, causing the expulsion from the so-called earthly paradise or Garden of Eden. In this sense, paradise is exactly the last part of the solar impulses that powerfully descended like a column on earth, or the story of Adam and Eve that is narrated in Genesis takes place. At the same time, the lower half of this man-fish tended more and more towards the hardening forces of the moon. So what we can call the more human half went towards the sun, the more fish-like half towards the moon, which was still inside the earth, which in turn was a liquid globe. We see here a difference forming between a higher, more suitable human being with respect to the contemporary human being. We can imagine it extending from the top of the head down to the pelvis, a little above the pelvis, including the bowels, whose forces were yearning for the sun, and a higher astrality, the lower human being, more coarse, that extended from the pelvis and therefore below the bowels to the feet, meaning our current feet, and whose forces were yearning for the moon and the low astrality. We can find these two halves of the man-fish in us even today, when we focus on perceiving ourselves from the top, from the fontanelle, from the crown of the skull to the bowels, and from the pelvis, in particular, to the feet, also keeping in mind that the pelvis, the part that corresponds to the zodiac sign of Libra, has become, in the course of evolution, illuminated by solar forces. In the stage we're talking about, it was not yet illuminated and will only be later, but let's keep it simple. Let's say that it's roughly the upper half of the body and the lower half of the body. This man-fish, who is half yearning for light and half yearning for darkness, is symbolically recalled by the archetypal images that are found in myths and legends of the mermaid and the Triton, and more generally of those who are called precisely fishmen. They are also called in Nordic traditions, for example, merfolk, which means people of the sea. Even today, when in our dreams, for example, mermaids or tritons appear, or any being that is human or humanoid on the upper part, and fish or serpent-like on the lower part, it means that not enough light of the eye consciousness has been brought below the pelvis, and therefore this part is still retaining an animal form similar to that which yearned for darkness in the second half of the Hyperborean era and in the first half of the Lemurian era, after the separation of the sun. So it means that there is a need to bring more light to the lower part of the body. We talked about this when we visited Turin and the Fountain of the Naiads at the Palazzo Reale. This is also linked, for example, to the legend of Melusine, also called the siren with two tails. To give you a pop reference, it's the Starbucks logo. These magical beings populating the legends are in contact with the etheric forces that form the earth, the sound ether that we mentioned, and therefore alchemy. The image of the two-tailed mermaid, or more generally of the mermaid or the Triton, is also an alchemical symbol, an alchemical allegory. As long as the light of the sun penetrated the upper human being, this could be filled with the forces of the sun gods, of the solar creator gods, that is, the highest hierarchies, while below, in the lower parts of the human being, sinking into the abysses of the terrestrial ocean, the human being felt abandoned by those same solar creator gods. So we have the union with the solar creator gods above, on the upper part of the body, the upper half, and the abandonment by the solar creator gods in the lower part of the body. Also, it's easy to understand that the lunar forces were increasingly predominant in the lower part of the body. The love that descended from the sun was therefore emanated into the cosmos, filling the upper half of the human being, while the sound in the death shaped the lower part of the human being. This primordial sound could only shape the earth thanks to the fact that one of the Elohim we have already mentioned made the sacrifice of staying behind. It was the spirit of the moon, Jehovah. Jehovah, or Yahweh, who sacrificed himself to join his existence to that of the earth moon and to follow the evolution of the earth not from the sun but more closely. First from inside the earth, when the moon was still interwoven with the earth, in this stage, and later from the stronghold of the moon, once Jehovah himself drew it out from the mass of the earth. Just as the 6 solar Elohim pulled the sun out of the earth moon, Jehovah pulled the moon out of the earth. 2 events, the first in the middle of the Hyperborean era, the second in the middle of the Lemurian era. We can imagine that Jehovah, as the solar Elohim detached from the earth, feels as if drawn towards the sun, because he belongs to the sun. He is already the spirit of the moon, but he would not need to remain united with the moon. But we have to imagine that it is as if these Elohim felt that the earth was being abandoned by the solar forces, and thus perceived that a sacrifice was necessary to prevent the earth from degenerating in its evolution. By feeling so strongly the nostalgia for the sun, it was risking to fall excessively into lunar forces and rigidity. So let's imagine this conscious realization. The solar Elohim detach themselves from the earth moon, and while the sun moves away and is assuming its current position at a distance from the earth, it's an image, Jehovah understands that he must remain united to the earth. So this spirit, which is the spirit of the sun, a spirit that would have had the power to direct the moon from the sun, decides that it's necessary to remain on the earth moon to direct the evolution of the earth in agreement with the Elohim, who instead go to the sun, the other solar Elohim. If it had been up to Jehovah, there would have been no need to remain on the earth moon. But all the Elohim together realize that the earth needs a sacrifice on their part, and this sacrifice is Jehovah. So, as the sun left the earth, Jehovah remained united to the center of the earth, which was still woven into the substance of the moon. Despite being a solar entity, therefore an Elohim, a spirit of form, Jehovah did not leave Earth, but joined that part that could have caused Earth to become hardened and irreparably damaged. He remained with the mass of the moon and directed the forces of sound so that they give form to what was necessary for the evolution of man, the earth and the cosmos. On the other hand, Jehovah also had the task of containing the forces of that most terrible astrality which had been trapped in the depth of the earth and in the lower half of the human being. This part of low astrality, very low astrality, had become increasingly hardened in the depth and had taken on a form independent of man. This is recalled in the archetypal image, which is found again and again in myths and legends, of the dragon. In this phase, Jehovah also holds the dragon in check for humanity. Moreover, it is also in this phase that humanity takes on its double, that is, the forces of the dragon and the snake, which we'll now talk about. So, as opposed to this primordial image of the lower and destructive astrality, that is, the dragon, we have the upper half of man who was penetrated by the divine solar forces. This is found as an archetypal image in the knight who kills the dragon. In a heavenly sense, it is Michael. In an earthly sense, it is St. George. But it is also found in other myths and legends, for example, in Siegfried, in the Ring of the Nibelungs. It is also found in Apollo killing Python, in Marduk against Tiamat in Babylonian mythology, and so on. On the other hand, the upper part of the human being and of earth was permeated by heat, which, when staying on the earth's surface, tended to form fiery currents. These fiery currents were woven into the forces that the earth retained on its surface from the gift of the sun. These currents of fire that flowed in the solar ether retained on earth are found in the archetypal image, the myths, and the legends of the serpent, also called the ancient serpent or the seducer, that is to say, the one we call the seducer or serpent Lucifer, just like we call the dragon Ahriman. In this phase, Jehovah helped man to remain united with the solar Elohim, keeping at bay both the dragon that wanted to rise from the depth and the ancient serpent that wanted to set the atmosphere on fire. We have come to the time when the forces of the moon, which had become too hardened on earth, and therefore also on man, had to fail. Then Jehovah alone extracted the mass of the moon from the earth. Imagine that just as the solar Elohim brought all the solar beings with them, Jehovah brought the lunar beings with him when he extracted the mass of the moon from the earth. The scar of this deed is the current position of the Pacific Ocean. Therefore, the Pacific Ocean and the moon, or rather the bottom of the Pacific Ocean and the moon, have the same composition, because they are derived from the same substance. The basalts of the Pacific Ocean and the lunar regolith, which is the lunar rock, have the same composition. On the other hand, the earth went on to crystallizing more and more, to becoming denser in the form of air, water and rocks, that is, gases, liquids and solids. You can see it in the diagram too, where solid, liquid, air, the ether of life, the chemical ether, the ether of light, and the ether of heat are added between the first half of the Lemurian era and the second half of the Lemurian era. The extraction of the moon from the earth caused real labor pains to the earth that was crossed by earthquakes and cataclysms, and in fact delivered the moon. If we want to see it in another way, you can think of Earth giving birth to the moon in the cosmos. After this, the moon continued to act with its hardening forces, but in a balance from outside the Earth. So the moon's hardening forces were not, shall we say, absolutely negative. They were not negative in so far as they could no longer act in the same way or in such an intense way from inside the earth. Once extracted from the earth, in balance with the spiritualizing solar forces, the two contributed to the earth's equilibrium. The upper parts of the moon deposited their heavier and coarser substances in the lower parts of the earth. For instance, as I was saying, the basalt of the Pacific Ocean and the lunar regolith. The upper parts of the moon deposited their heavier and coarser substances in the lower parts of the earth. Gradually, air formed at the top, although it was still permeated by water, and a solid core of the earth formed, surrounded by water. The surrounding mist was still penetrated by the sun's rays. But to a different degree, depending on how rarefied it was. The more rarefied it was, the more it could be penetrated by the sun's rays. The denser it was, the less this was possible. It gradually became rarefied due to the denser substances settling towards the center of the earth. This is the so-called separation of the upper waters from the lower waters. At the same time, because man and earth are one, human beings also began to solidify, to become denser, and the upper part became able to breathe air. And this is a very important event, for at this point, Rudolf Steiner, after having made this cosmic description, tells us what all this has to do with ancient Egyptian initiation. Everything up to this point in the conference was a premise that he made. So, the fact that man began to breathe air means that the spiritual archetype of the lungs had appeared, which before originally, as we said, received the divine solar light. So, originally these lungs in the man-fish were full of light that came from the sun. Now it is as if the light that comes from the sun separated from the element of air, and in the lungs, in this supersensible archetype of the lungs, the air stays while the light is placed all around. It is earthly air that separates from the light of the sun. So the air now penetrated the human being through the breath, while the light became more and more capable of reaching only the outside of the human being. The force of solar light that once filled the human being from within now touches him from without, while earthly air penetrates within. Solar light and earthly air thus went their separate ways, differentiating. At this point, an inside and an outside of the human being come into existence. The outside still touched by the light of the sun, the inside with the lungs into which earthly air can enter. As long as the human plant, the man flower, was breathing divine sunlight, it didn't know the difference between inside and outside. between birth and death, but only experienced a changing of one form into another, like changing clothes for us, and therefore felt eternal. It changed its own form without suffering, without interruption of consciousness, even if it was a tenuous consciousness, still plant-like. Then, when the first breath of earthly air arose and sunlight began to touch them only from the outside, human beings started feeling birth and death as events interrupting what was previously continuous, eternal. Thus, the awareness of being born and dying set in, and with it, the awareness of life between the two. So the awareness of being born and dying is closely linked to the fact that light has separated from air, that human beings no longer breathe light, but breathe air. This is why the ancient Egyptian initiate perceived this moment of the separation of light from air as the entry of the forces of the god called Set. The Greeks called it typhon, which means breath of air. Today, we call a strong wind typhoon, in the sense of terrestrial air. Set, on the other hand, means desert wind, being he the god of desolation, of that which is deprived of life by the arid breath of the desert. Therefore, both the Greek name typhon and the Egyptian Set have the same meaning. Typhon is a breath of wind, a breath of air, and Set is desert wind. The ancient Egyptian initiate thus experienced the splitting of light and air, so that once this experience of the ancient Egyptian mysteries was shared with the people outside, a myth arose of the killing of the sun god Osiris by his brother Set or Typhon, the god of the desert wind. Osiris, the living god of the sun, was originally with his brother Set, the god of the desert wind. Then they separated and Set ended Osiris' life. The light stopped permeating the human being from within, and the terrestrial air penetrated in its stead. Air that carried the awareness of birth and death. This long introduction about cosmic evolution served to describe the separation of light from air, solar light from earthly air, and the first breath of earthly air by man, who no longer perceived the breathing of light. It is in that moment that the forces of Seth kill the forces of Osiris. In that moment, the consciousness of birth and death makes its entrance. To be continued. With this, I thank you for listening to this 5th meeting, and I'll see you next week with the 6th.